Hello, good morning, PAX. Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming out to join us this morning, for coming out to hear me tell my story. This is a crazy, surreal experience. I'm excited, humbled by the invitation. So for those of you who haven't watched one of these talks before, I did a bunch of research, watched the last 10 years or so online to help prepare. The theme is Storytime. It's a developer talking about their own personal journey, their story in the game industry, and that's what I'm going to be doing. Maybe some lessons learned along the way. If you're hoping to learn about the next WoW patch, sorry, this is not going to be that kind of talk. So it's been a crazy month. August 2018, as we stand here at the end of it, 2.5 weeks ago, we just released this little game called Battle for Azeroth. It's been amazing seeing millions of people around the world jump in and just dig into exploring this labor of love of the entire World of Warcraft team over the last 2+ years. But when PAX reached out to me with the invitation to come give this talk, it was, on the one hand, the worst conceivable timing, since kind of had a game to release. On the other hand, actually, really, really fitting timing, because I've been reflecting on my own journey and how the events that led me to this point. Because actually 10 years ago, on this very day, I was starting at Blizzard Entertainment. My first week at Blizzard, my first week on the World of Warcraft team. I had just flown out from the East Coast. I was living in temp housing, out of a suitcase, gotten in the night before. I woke up crazy early in the morning, a mix of nerves and still being on East Coast time. Called a yellow cab to take me to Blizzard offices. This was way before Lyft and Uber were a thing, and I didn't have a car yet since I just moved out here. And I was standing there 7:30, looking up at these gates. I was pretty much the only one there, because this is a game development studio, and it was 7 in the morning. But was excited, anxious, a little scared, but above all, just eager to begin this next step in my journey. And part of why it was so impactful, though, was not just the fact that I was here at the campus of this company that had made games I played throughout my entire life that I'd idolized, but because of, in some other ways, how unlikely it was. Because actually 5 years prior, 15 years ago today, I was actually sitting in a classroom just like this at NYU School of Law, beginning my 3rd year as a law student, taking a criminal procedure class. And I had been following what felt like a pretty steady path throughout my entire life. Really, as long as I could remember, I'd wanted to be a lawyer. And maybe when I was 5, I wanted to be an astronaut, but that was a phase. But for most intents and purposes, this is a goal that I had pursued, and there was a fair amount of certainty and comfort there. I had a job lined up for after I graduated. Life was good. I think my interest in the law, actually goes back quite a ways. I think when I was 11 or 12, doing some summer reading, actually read this book, John Grisham's The Firm. And it wasn't the money laundering for the mob, though that was appealing. It was actually the first part of the book, reading about a young lawyer's graduating from law school, looking for law firms. Spoilers, he picked the wrong one. But the details, the minutiae, the day-to-day work, the sorts of problems, the real legal talk that fleshed out the background of the story actually fascinated me. I wanted to learn more. It sounded really cool, sounded really interesting to me. So I talked to some family friends, sought out whatever resources I could, and everything I learned about the law appealed to me. Throughout my life, I've always liked solving puzzles. I've liked, problems. And that's how I viewed the law. I think at its core, legal practice is basically taking a puzzle that consists of a set of facts, a set of laws, some extra resources like maybe interpretations of those laws, other documents that have been written, and solving a puzzle that is, what is the best argument you can make given these fixed things in support of this position? And it wasn't just about making the argument. That was the first half of it. You might have this perfect idea in your head, or so you thought, but you also needed to be able to express it, to convince others through word, written, spoken, of the validity of your argument. And in the course of making that argument, you might often realize that it wasn't quite as perfect as you'd imagined. And you could do all of this in service of protecting rights, in service of society as a whole. What's not to like? And so I was sold. I was hooked. A lot of the choices I made from that point on, classes I took, extracurriculars I pursued, they were all in service of this idea. In my, even, back then I was like 11, 12, oh, I'm going to be a lawyer when I grow up. And so when I got to college, a few years down the line, I took classes that were tailored to that goal. And 4 years later, when I made it to NYU and was starting law school there, it felt like I had realized this dream I had 10 years ago. It felt pretty amazing. And there's something to be said for that. And it was, I felt like I had this great life ahead of me that I'd planned for. And yet, as we just saw, not that many years later, I found myself standing in front of the gates of Blizzard on a cool morning in Irvine. So what happened? Now, there's another side to my life that maybe makes it not quite as crazy. Let's take a look at that. Going way, way back, 1983, this was a big year in the life of young Ian Hazzikostas. I was getting ready to start my first year of preschool. Also, I had just been introduced to a world that would, captivate me throughout the rest of my life to come. So my mother was an elementary school teacher. She taught first grade and was actually transitioning to being a computer teacher as computers began to get more and more of a place in schools around the country. And so based on some of those readings, and she was reading about the value of educational software, computers to the development of young minds, we brought home this, Texas Instruments TI-99 4A. And had, definitely there was some educational software, played some number games, spelling games, other things along those lines. But as we've seen, if there's a device that can have games on it, it will have games on it. Doesn't matter whether it's a calculator, whatever it is. And so out of all those, the one that sticks out in my mind the most, and I don't expect many or even any of you to have played this or remember it, but there's this game called Tunnels of Doom. And this came out in 1982. It's actually crazy ahead of its time in a lot of ways. It was basically a roguelike. It was a 10-layer procedurally generated dungeon. You'd make a party of adventurers at the start, and your goal was to make it to the lowest level of the dungeon where you could rescue a king who was trapped there. And you'd explore, defeat monsters, randomly generated levels each time, buy weapons and shops along the way, and if you lost, game over, try again. When I first started playing this, I really was a bit too young, couldn't make heads or tails of it, spent a lot of time exploring the top levels and getting nowhere, but I was still captivated. And over the course of the next couple of years, I made greater strides and eventually managed to get to the depths of the dungeon. And it was a great triumph at the time. But it really opened my eyes to this whole world of fantasy and imagination and looking beyond simple graphics and lines and pixels and dreams of adventure and progression and rewards and a lot of things that I would continue to seek out in games across the rest of my life. Just kind of let's take a quick tour through some of those. So a few years later, slightly better graphics. For context, I was a Nintendo kid. I was an Apple kid. My mother, still an educator. We had educational discounts on Apple computers and later Macs. So that's what we had around the house. I never actually had a standard PC computer until many, many, many years later when I was in law school, when I actually needed a laptop for exam-taking software. And so in the meantime, the games that I played were the ones that were available in that universe. And of course, that's a big part of what attracted me to Blizzard games in the first place, because all of their games throughout the 90s ended up on the Mac, which was unusual at the time. So moving on, slightly better graphics, interesting variety. One thing, though, that stands out, not better graphics, in the upper right here, we just have a bunch of text. And so in the 90s, we started to see the emergence of the very first online multiplayer games. Back then, these were bulletin board door games that you'd call into a computer, usually maintained by just a random hobbyist, and play through these games, often taking turns, because only one person at a time could connect. This was something that my friends and I were super into when we were in junior high school, early high school. And these games opened my eyes to the possibility that gaming wasn't just about sitting next to somebody on a couch and sharing that experience with them, but that it could bring people together from much greater distances. You could even meet people through these online games. And later, Again, slightly nicer graphics. It's a pretty cool game called Diablo there in the upper right. That was a pretty big fixture in 1998 for me. But in the lower right, again, another text-based online game, a MUD, a multi-user dungeon. And these are really the progenitors of the MMORPG in a lot of ways. You can think of them as MMORPGs. They weren't massive, but there were hundreds of people, maybe, participating in these worlds. They were persistent environments with drama and buffs and nerfs and balance, and a lot of the things that came to define the MMO genre thereafter. I spent quite a bit of time playing a couple of them, and actually, at some point when I was taking some college programming classes, a few online friends and I tried to start our own, and we spent a few months puzzling through the idea of coming up with our own classes and spells and building our own world. And it was enthralling. And so the sum of all this is that from the earliest age, from when I was 4 onwards, I had been immersing myself in a wide variety of these games, often with progression elements, often with online components, and training myself in a way that wasn't even conscious at the time, but because of the stuff I mentioned earlier with how I like to approach things as puzzles and problems to be untangled and unraveled, I was just naturally thinking about what worked, what didn't, what I liked, what I didn't, what frustrated me. I got to see how buffs or nerfs played out in some of these online environments and learn lessons from that. I was doing what was actually, in a sense, building a skill set. A slight digression. You'll often hear game developers, game designers talk about someone, whether it's praising a colleague or evaluating an interview candidate. They'll talk about someone's design instincts. Someone has good instincts or someone has questionable instincts. And instinct is a funny word because it makes it sound like you sprang fully formed from the womb, destined to make games, like it's a baby bird in its nest. But that's not what instinct means in this case. Instinct is more a reflection of something that we as humans are just naturally adept at, which is consolidating vast amounts of information and experience into finding patterns and then using that to guide our intuition, to guide what you can think of as instinct. Consider chess, for example. A novice chess player might look at a board and evaluate every possible move one at a time, thinking through, like, if I do this, and then she does that, and then I could do this. Oh, wait, never mind, that's bad. Let me go down a different direction. A master who has spent thousands of hours and looked at hundreds of thousands of positions might just have an intuitive sense looking at a board within a matter of a second or two of this is a strong position or this is a weak position, or might even see a winning move. And that's effectively the pattern recognition. That is the consolidation of vast amounts of experience, and that's something that guides designers, guides people in almost any creative area where you can't possibly evaluate every possibility. You have to have something to guide you to pick one or the other. Anyway, that's effectively what I've been doing. That's effectively how I've been training myself in the course of just living my life and having fun. And there's a couple of books I'd recommend if you're interested in learning more about sort of the formation of those thought processes or the factors that lead people to success and much, much more. I mean, there's many, many talks worth of information contained in these books, but they're both great reads. Now, I just want to take a second to make it clear. As I was assembling these slides, it occurred to me, I didn't want to paint a misleading picture. My life wasn't just, okay, I played a bunch of video games for 20 years, and that was what prepared me to be a game developer, to be a game designer down the line. And I think there's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot more to me than that. As a random example, so if you've looked at my name, it may not come as a huge surprise that I have some Greek heritage. My father was born in Greece. And when I was growing up, the bedtime stories that he would read me were actually Greek myths. Those were my fairy tales. It was Perseus and Medusa, Theseus and the Minotaur, Heracles and his labors trying to atone to the gods. Those were the stories that captivated me, that transported me. And as soon as I could read better, those were some of the first books that I sought out and asked my parents for so I could learn more. And later on, whenever I could, I wanted to delve more deeply into those worlds, into other mythologies. That interest actually led me, when I was in high school, to take Latin instead of German or French or Spanish or something more conventional, because I wanted to be closer to these stories that had helped just shape my imagination when I was young. Also collected a ton of baseball cards, was super into baseball. When I was 10 or 11, I probably could have named the starting roster of every Major League Baseball team. A lot of number crunching, and again, just a totally separate facet of the interests that I was exploring. Speaking of numbers, I always liked math, liked puzzles. I liked math puzzles. I was actually captain of my high school math team, just to give you the level of nerd we're talking about here. It's pretty high, spoilers. And I even did high school theater. It's a mix of following friends into this, but wanting to challenge myself, wanting to take more risks, wanting to learn a bit about what could lead me to be up on stage and be a bit vulnerable in front of a crowd of people. Not quite this size of crowd, but it was something. The point is, there's a lot more to me than just the games that I played, and I think there's a lot more to anyone who comes into the game industry than just the games that they've played. The games are a piece of it, but they're not the whole. I think with any art form, and that's what games are, there's mastery and knowledge of the craft, but there's also the perspective that you bring to it. And I think one of the cool things about the game industry is that really, only very recently were there formal programs that you could take to prepare you for game development. Almost everybody had some different story, especially if you go back 10, 15 years. They started out with some different plan in life, a different set of interests that led them there. And so whether it's someone who has a fascination with history that informs their world building, or someone who is an outdoorsman who goes hiking and camping, and those pictures, those images seared on their mind, or it makes them, or it guides their environment art. I think everyone brings something, some new perspective, and that's what actually expands the medium, as well as just enabling it. Anyway, slight digression. Let's get back to our story. So, 2004, I graduated from law school. I moved down to Washington, D.C. for my very first real job as an adult. I was working as a clerk for a federal appellate judge in D.C., and this was an amazing job. It was everything I had hoped the law would be. It was everything I wanted it to be. I was working with kind, smart, talented people, helping to research and evaluate litigants' positions and their briefs, and help my judge reach conclusions of law. And these were important things that I would see in newspaper headlines once they were decided. And so I was doing interesting, fascinating work, and I was making a difference in the world. Life was still good. Things were good. Now, after I got settled, about 3 months after that, there's this game that came out. And so I've been a huge Blizzard fan all my life. I played Warcraft 2 on dial-up with friends in high school and was steeped in this world. But I'll be honest, I hadn't actually paid a ton of attention to the details of World of Warcraft. I had just graduated from law school, taken the bar exam, relocated my whole life, was moving. And so while I knew about World of Warcraft, I hadn't played the beta. I didn't really know all the details. But I had, at this point, I had some free time. I had settled into a new routine, was looking for a new game to play. This seemed like the perfect time. And so for a while, I was just going to, my plan was to just hop on a random server and go from there. But I decided to reach out to a friend of mine named Owen, who I'd played some online games with in the past, just to ask, hey, are you going to play World of Warcraft? If so, any recommendation on what server I should pick? And he said, yes, I'm definitely playing. I'm playing with this big internet forum guild. You should come join us. We're going Horde. And so I said, sure, why not? I did. Fateful decision that would shape the next 14 years of my life, made just really on the spur of the moment. And so World of Warcraft came out late November 2004, and I think it was Thanksgiving break, and I had winter recess coming up for the court, so I actually had a fair bit of free time, and I really jumped in and started exploring and immersing myself in this world. And going in relatively blind actually made it even more magical. I think more so than if I had played the beta or had been reading about it religiously for the prior months, because every adventure, every place I went was a new discovery, and it was the best game I'd ever played. There's no question about it, and really became a fixture for me going forward. Now, I was just one person in this giant guild with hundreds of people. Again, it was just internet forums guild, not like a tight-knit group of friends, just anybody who wanted to join, anybody who wanted to play together, who was a member of this community. But as some time passed, early 2005, I was max level, and the group started making their first explorations into the game's first big raid zone, this place called Molten Core, a 40-player dungeon. And so they were looking for warm bodies because there weren't that many people max level at the time. And so I volunteered and tagged along. Now, back then, the game's user interface was very, very simple. And even though this was a 40-player group, the UI by default only actually let you see the other 4 players in your 5-player party. And I had the misfortune of being placed in a group that didn't have a healer, which meant that no one could actually see that I was injured, let alone target me to heal me, which meant that I spent like 90% of the raid dead. But it was super fun, and it was, I was seeing this thing that only a few thousand people in the world had seen at this point, and we failed repeatedly and got nowhere. But it was awesome. World of Warcraft in 2005, ladies and gentlemen. We went back, reassembled the group, maybe with a little bit more ambition this time, a bit more of a plan. But things were still rough. We made it a bit further in, but for those of you who played and who remember Molten Core, there were these mobs called Ancient Corehounds that would respawn very frequently. And as we slowly were slogging our way through the place, very commonly one of them would respawn right on top of our group, kill us, and it's like, all right, back to the entrance and more stuff to re-clear. It was very slow going. Now, for whatever reason, I happened to have one of these on my desk. Not this exact thing, but something that looked a whole lot like it. I have no really good explanation. I think I basically used it as a little fidget clicker thing before fidget spinners and cubes and stuff existed. But I happened to notice that there was a pattern to what the Corehounds were doing, that they would respawn every 15 to 18 minutes or so. And so I started timing them. I actually used the physical stopwatch. When we killed one, I would start the timer, and actually started calling out. I spoke up for one of the first times on our voice comms, it was Ventrilo at the time, and said, hey, this is when it's safe to move up, we should wait, respawn soon. And before I knew it, after about 20, 30 minutes of this, I was basically de facto leading the raid, because I was telling the group when it was safe to move, when it wasn't, where to stand, and when. And it turns out, a lot of the time, in order to lead effectively, you just need to step up and do it. There's hard work that is desired, and as soon as you can perform a valuable function, people will listen. And I basically went from being the anonymous member of the raid group, dying repeatedly in a group with no healer, to the group's raid leader over the course of a week or two. And so as we adventured further into Molten Core, we eventually, over the course of weeks to come, defeated Ragnaros, defeated Onyxia. We were a full-fledged raiding guild. We could take pride in the fact that, especially back then, there were only a few thousand people who had seen what we had seen, who had done what we had done. Felt amazing. Now, continuing further, 2 raid zones later, there was this zone called Ankiraj that opened up in early 2006. And this is where my guild hit one of our first real brick walls. We were struggling with this encounter called the Twin Emperors. And I was pretty sure that, based on what I had seen, that we had found a serious bug with the encounter. It was a very specific technical bug that required, if you were doing the strat that we were trying to do, we'd run into something that was posing a major setback. Now, at the time, that posed certain challenges, because the culture in the WoW community was one of near absolute secrecy around raiding. This is something that had been inherited from the game EverQuest previously, where raid bosses were, there was a single one in a public space, and if you killed it, another guild on the server couldn't. And so the knowledge of how to overcome encounters was something to be zealously guarded. And even though World of Warcraft encounters were instanced, the community had kind of carried that set of guidelines, those set of rules forward. And so I couldn't just go post on the forums, hey, this is what we're seeing, this is how we're doing the encounter, and this is the bug we're running into. So I was kind of at a loss. But I remembered, speaking of EverQuest, that one of the lead developers on World of Warcraft had actually been a well-known EverQuest raider in the past. And so I actually went to an old EverQuest guild forum, where I knew he had posted long, long ago, made an account there, and sent him a private message saying, hi, sorry to bother you. I think I have a bug. And I explained and sent my message and thought nothing further of it. A couple days later, he got back to me. He thanked me for reporting the bug, appreciated it, said in the future, if you want to reach out to me, you don't have to go to this forum, here's my email address. And so I began corresponding with this guy, sending him feedback, reporting bugs here and there where I could. The name he went by on those forums was Tiggle, or as you know him today, Papa Jeff. So Jeff Kaplan, then lead game designer on World of Warcraft, became an invaluable resource. I did my best to not take advantage of this lifeline, this direct connection that I had. But when I had feedback, when I had concerns, when I had bug reports to share, I would send him email about them. And we continued to go on over the course of the rest of the expansion and became a relatively solid raid guild. We were, at some point, one of the top 10 or 20 in North America, at least. Burning Crusade, I think, elevated the game to new heights. I took a brief break somewhere along the line, just a little bit burned out after Naxxramas. But our guild was doing great. And really, the life I was leading at this point was very much like lawyer by day, raid leader by night. And two separate worlds. I was kind of a closet gamer at work. No one would have guessed or known. And then I was going home, and I had this alter ego. And yeah, so our guild site, back then, it was very common. Everyone would have a guild website. You would post screenshots on it. You would keep people up to date on your latest kills. Not that anyone really cared for the most part, but it's just something you did. But in this case, a lot of people from other top guilds started coming to our guild forums to congregate, to discuss, to share information, to learn. And it was a place where there were a lot of smart people with varied backgrounds. Some of them were graduate students studying math and statistics. Others were programmers. Others were actually developers in the industry, who all shared a common bent of liking analysis, liking to solve problems, liking to solve puzzles, and started to pick apart the way World of Warcraft worked. I think it's a stretch to claim this is where theory crafting on the internet started, but I think it's definitely a part of that story. And so it was awesome seeing our humble guild website become a nexus of discussion and analysis as people tried to, for the first time, definitively answer, well, when you're playing this class, is it better to use this rotation or that rotation? Not just what feels better or what do you think is better, but what is provably better. And this also, I think, opened my eyes to the level of depth and analysis that was possible in some of these games, as well as expanding the community of awesome folks that I'm in contact with and gain contact with. I think there was somebody who was a member of the forums back then who was actually starting to apply to law school, who knew I was a lawyer, who reached out to message me to ask for advice on applying to law schools, who's now actually completely separately himself a developer at Blizzard. And it's a small world. It's a small world, and the internet makes it a smaller one, and it's amazing. Speaking of which, later that year, I went to my very first Blizzcon. The first Blizzcon had been held in 2005, but I wasn't nearly, didn't know enough about the game back then to even consider going. But by this point, it was something I knew I had to go to. And this was the first time meeting many of my guildmates face-to-face who also made the trip out or who lived in California. It was also a chance for me to meet Jeff, who I'd been corresponding with, and also to grab lunch with him and a couple of other folks like Alex Afrasiabi, who's now our creative director, or Scott Mercer, who was then lead encounter designer, that I'd been sending feedback to as well and reaching out to and kind of corresponding with, but as a player to developer. And I think to this day, I have people occasionally reach out and send me messages, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or elsewhere. And I do my best to try to respond to as many as I can because I remember how much it meant to me as a player to feel like I had this connection with the developer of the game that really was this massive central part of my life. And anything I can do to help share a bit of that feeling, to help pay a bit of that back, I want to do. So now, let's pull back a second to the other half of my life. So after my one-year clerkship ended, unfortunately, it was only a one-year gig. I would have kept doing that job forever if they'd let me, but it was a time-limited thing, and then I probably wouldn't be here. I went on to work at a law firm doing sort of large-scale commercial litigation. I had a pretty significant amount of student debt to pay off coming out of law school, and so going to a firm like this was the best way to do it. And I was still working alongside a lot of smart, kind people, doing a lot of fascinating work, but also an increasing amount that wasn't quite as enthralling. And I think Part of what modern litigation involves is this wonderful process called discovery, where when you need to settle a dispute, you ask the other side, whether the other side is another civil party or whether it's the government, and vice versa. You ask, hey, can you give me all of the documents in your possession that relate to X? And they do. And maybe 30, 40 years ago, it was like, here's 2 boxes of stuff. Nowadays, it's, here are 3.7 gigabytes of text files from our entire Exchange server and every email that might be potentially responsive. And guess who gets to go through and process a lot of those things? Lawyers. And so there was less of the puzzle solving, the problem solving that I loved, and a bit more like fishing through boxes to find the right puzzle pieces to even begin solving. And so I was starting to look for something a bit different. I was applying for other legal jobs at the time, and reached out in passing to my friend Owen, the same guy who'd recommended the Guild way back in 2004, to see, just to kind of complain, honestly. Applying for jobs kind of sucks, like sending out letters, resumes, the general stress of it. And around this time, he actually confided in me a secret. He had actually just gotten a job at Blizzard. He had been a programmer previously and kind of changed gears, largely inspired by his heavy passion for World of Warcraft. And he was having a blast. I think he loved it. He had no regrets whatsoever. But that opened a little door in my mind. It got me for the very first time thinking, like, wait, is that something I could do? And I quickly decided, no, of course not. That's stupid. I'm a lawyer. I spent the last 10 years of my life preparing for this, training for this, going to school. What do I know about game design anyway? That's dumb. But a few more months passed. And I had found a couple of other jobs, other legal jobs. Nothing that was super exciting to me, though. And that itch still remained. So I reached back out to Owen, and I said, hey, does Blizzard have any design openings? Is there anything, might there be any possibility there? And graciously, he agreed to act as a referral if I wanted to apply. And I wrote what I can say is probably one of the most ill-advised cover letters, in which I said, literally, I don't know that I want this job. And I did this because it was true. I was like, in my mind, I'm still a lawyer, but man, I'm so curious to learn more here. And I was really worried that my friend would be sticking his neck out, acting as a reference for me, and then I might just get cold feet and back out of the whole process partway through. But I applied, and then the next thing that happened was Blizzard sent me a design test. It was a lengthy series of questions ranging from design 3 new abilities for this class for the next expansion, to how would you modify this encounter to be suitable for a different raid size. A bunch of stuff that I never really thought about before in those terms. But it was awesome. I spent the whole weekend just writing thousands of words in response to these questions. And I knew even if I didn't go any further in the process, it was worth it just for that alone. It was actually genuinely a super fun experience. But they actually invited me out for an interview. And so I flew out to California and found myself on the Blizzard campus, getting ready for a day of face-to-face discussions with this development team that I'd watched from afar, that I'd idolized. And again, kind of like doing the test, it was the most amazing experience. As a closet gamer who'd been living this kind of double life previously, actually sitting down in a professional setting with the trappings of a job interview and debating class design for 30 minutes was surreal, but it was awesome. I had an amazing time. It was this whirlwind, fantastical journey. And I got back on a plane, flew back to DC, and went back to work the next day. Thought nothing further of it. A month passed, and Blizzard reached back out to me and said, we want to offer you a job. And suddenly this all became super real. Because it actually hadn't totally been up until that point, in all honesty, right? It was still like, yeah, I'm a lawyer, this is the life that I'm living, but I've had this amazing little side journey, and this was just fantastic. But then I had the very real question of, am I going to walk away from my career? Am I going to walk away from financial security, from the one side of the country to the other? All of these things. I reached out to friends and family for advice. My parents initially thought I'd lost my mind. As you might imagine, they're like, wait, you want to do what? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to. Because if I didn't, I realized this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, truly. I was incredibly fortunate to have had it come across my lap. And if I didn't, odds were good I was going to wake up one day, whether it was a month later, whether it was a year later, whether it was 5 years later, or come home after a hard day at work, feeling a bit down, and I'd have that moment of regret, that moment of wondering, what would it have been like? What if I had chased this opportunity? And I didn't want to feel that way. So I took some safety precautions. I talked to I gave myself 1 year. I talked to a recruiter to make sure I wasn't completely damaging my future career prospects if I took a year off from the law. But I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take a chance, just as Blizzard took a gigantic chance on me, an unproven developer. I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to see if I like it, if I'm any good at it, if they like me. And so that brings us back to where our story began. As I was standing in front of these gates on that morning in August 2008, excited and looking ahead to this next chapter in my life. And I walked in. Now, I was arriving at a very eventful time in the company. Summer 2008 was just a couple of months before Wrath of the Lich King came out, the second expansion for World of Warcraft. This was a super, super busy time as the last stretch, the last sprint to the finish line before an expansion can be. At the end of my first week, Jeff Kaplan actually called the whole design team together and said, hey, we have 3.5 weeks to make the game the players deserve, to finish it, to do everything in our power to make this memorable. And this was our charge. This was kind of the last sprint to the finish. And there was a lot of work left to be done. And he came aside and talked to me afterwards to say, hey, Ian, like, you just got here. Don't feel any pressure or obligation. This doesn't apply to you. This is more just everyone has a lot of work on their plate they need to finish up. Don't feel any obligation to stay late or do anything extra. I looked at him like he was insane. Like, at the time, I was living in temp housing out of a suitcase. Was I going to go home and watch bad TV in a town where I knew no one? Or was I going to stay at the office and make World of frickin' Warcraft? It was World of frickin' Warcraft. At the time, also, so we were a bit less efficient in some ways than we are these days. Back then, the entire zone of Icecrown, the top end of Northrend, the continent where the expansion was set, was basically 70% empty. There were 0 creatures in it. It did not look like the place where the armies of the Lich King were to be found. All of that needed to be fixed in the last 3 to 4 weeks before we got the game into players' hands. Because that's part of the nature of a live product to some extent. I think Blizzard is very well known for, we ship things when they're ready, but in a live game, to some extent, quantity and timeliness is quality, right? Making people wait 12 months for something new, that's not doing the right thing for our players. But I had the immediate amazing experience of my initial work, literally the things I did on my first days in the company. I could come back after the weekend and go to player fan sites and see that work on the front page of those fan sites because a new beta build had been pushed out and had been data mined. And that was surreal to me. Like, I had gone from playing this game to I just put something in it and other people are playing it literally overnight. It was crazy. So Wrath came out, and I settled into a new role as a dungeon and raid encounter designer. That was my first job formally on Wrath of the Lich King. And I loved it, right? I mean, I knew pretty quickly that I wasn't going to need a year for this trial period, that I was sold. This was a place I was very happy to be, working around awesome people, working on this game that I loved. But even so, there were some early challenges. I think one of the biggest ones was actually becoming adjusted, becoming used to the creative process. All through my life previously, I had worked and lived in a domain of certainty. That's what I've been conditioned to do from a young age, right? Whether it's an elementary school teacher asking, what's 7 times 9? And I would raise my hand, and I knew that it was 63, and that was an answer that I could give and be recognized and rewarded and praised for giving that answer. Or years later in high school, it's like a US history teacher asking, what's the XYZ affair, and what was its impact on late 18th century US-French relations? If I didn't know it, I was going to stay quiet, but if I knew it, I'd be that obnoxious kid raising his hand, saying, ooh, me, because I had an answer to share. But if I didn't know I was right, why open my mouth? Why take that risk? Now take that logic, take that upbringing, take that training, and transplant it into a creative environment. It's apples and oranges. It's a night and day difference. If we're sitting around with a group discussing boss mechanics, like there's a skeletal frost dragon, what should that dragon do? What is right? What is wrong? What is smart? What is stupid? What's a good idea? What's a bad idea? How could I have the confidence to open my mouth and say, well, what if the dragon encases some players in ice and their allies have to hide behind those ice blocks and break them out? Is that smart? How should I know? How should anyone know? And so there's something terrifying, actually, about vocalizing these thoughts and exposing them to judgment of others without any knowledge of whether they're good or bad. And it's something that I think you almost never let go of entirely. I've heard people, very senior folks at Blizzard, people with lead, people with director in their title, who will preface something they say at a meeting with, this is a terrible idea, but. And there's that little bit of deflection, there's that little bit of a safety net of like, I don't know that this is good either, but bear with me. And even to this day, I sometimes catch myself, looking around a room as I'm beginning to speak, sharing a thought, looking for micro reactions on people's faces to know whether they're, whether they think it's good or whether there's some level of disgust or mockery. And I think what follows from that is it's something that's essential. That's how the creative process works. That's how brainstorming works. It's something that I needed to get past. But it's also something that now in my role as a leader, and I think for anyone out there who is facilitating or trying to organize a creative group, a creative process, I think the most important thing you can do is make sure that it feels like a safe place to share those ideas, that there's never a sense of judgment or something that's going to make somebody withdraw and refrain from offering their opinion next time. Because without that, the final result, the whole ends up being poorer. I think that was a huge takeaway for me over the course of that initial onboarding and shifting my thinking from a legal framework to a creative design framework. Moving on, a couple of years later, the Cataclysm expansion. As this was coming out, I actually made a shift from working on encounter design to working on class design. And I would still try to juggle the two where I could, but my primary job was coming up with new abilities, tuning, balancing, improving the overall feel of several of World of Warcraft's character classes. And I would try to still do a raid boss when I could, every patch or so, as a great way to kind of shift gears. If I hit a creative block in one area, I would focus my attention on the other until I could come back. But I learned a lot from this process. On paper, balance feels like objective math, right? It feels like something grounded in those areas of certainty I was talking about earlier. But it's not always. So here's an anecdote from early in Cataclysm. Now, in our game, we have a Death Knight class that has two different specializations that both deal damage. One is Unholy, one is Frost. And by this point, several years after the origins of my guild forums, the community was very adept at sharing and breaking down knowledge. They collected combat logs, aggregated them, and processed them. You could see almost like a stock market index based on every knight's raids. You knew who was doing how well, and players definitely let us know. So in this world, there was a sense that Frost was lagging a bit behind Unholy in most situations. And Frost Death Knights justifiably reached out to us and said, why do you hate us, Blizzard? What do you have against Frost? I just want to play the specialization that I enjoy, but everyone knows we're terrible. And so we looked at the numbers and our own internal data, simulations, and we realized, we think they're right. Frost is a few % behind Unholy. Let's make some finely calibrated adjustments to Frost to bring them up so that they're equal to Unholy. And so that's what we did. And then a week passed. We pushed our changes to Frost live, and this is what happened. Because it turns out MMOs are simpler or more complicated than just an abstract set of numbers. There are people behind these characters. And human psychology is a fascinating thing. What happened was theory crafters, number crunchers looked at our changes and said, Frost is now a fraction of a percent better than Unholy under optimal circumstances, which then was translated to Frost is the new best spec to play, which then meant that all of the very best players who cared most about min-maxing, for whom making that number the biggest it could be was their source of joy in the game, they switched from Unholy to Frost. If you looked at this chart, you would think we had nerfed Unholy. In fact, not long later, Unholy players were like, why did you nerf us? Why do you hate Unholy, Blizzard? The moral of the story, balance is harder than it seems. So later this year, again, obviously, BlizzCon has been a largely annual event. But BlizzCon 2010 was a special one for me, because it was actually my first BlizzCon where I had a role on stage. I was asked for the first time to be part of a Q&A panel with the other class and systems designers. And up until this point, I had actually lied to my guildmates, because back then, it was considered of utmost importance that no one should know that you are a developer at Blizzard when you're playing World of Warcraft. I told my guildmates that I was working at a law firm in LA. I had to tell them I'd switched coasts because my time zone had changed. But even at BlizzCon 2008, 2009, I had hung out with them. I just kind of still did it like a player would. Because on some level, this reflected the fact that I was still living a double life in a sense. Yes, I was going to work, and I was making bosses in World of Warcraft, and I was adjusting classes and doing those sorts of things. But I hadn't fully embraced what my life was. I hadn't fully embraced my identity as a Blizzard game developer yet. When Wrath of the Lich King came out, Blizzard hosted a local signing event in the Orange County area for people to come bring their collector's editions and get them signed by the development team. I didn't go to that. I stayed home and played the game at the stroke of midnight, because I was still a WoW player more than I was a WoW developer. I didn't think of myself as deserving to be there signing that box. I had just worked on the game for a few weeks, not the years these people had. That wasn't really where I felt comfortable. This BlizzCon changed that. I think I had to break the news to my guildmates the night before at dinner. Hey, by the way, you might see me on stage tomorrow. Sorry for all the deception over the years. But really, moving forward from that point on, it was truly real. The last vestiges of the old life that I had still clung to, I had left behind. So moving on, another couple of years to Mists of Pandaria, our fourth expansion. Now, at the start of Mists, Scott Mercer, who had been leading counter designer on World of Warcraft for many years, one of the folks I had met and had lunch with at BlizzCon way back 5 years earlier, decided he wanted to, after a decade of service on the World of Warcraft team, move on to a different project within Blizzard, leaving the leading counter position opened. And I didn't know that I was ready for it, but being the typically almost like ambitious by default sort of person, it's like, hey, there's a job, it's a promotion, you should apply for it. I applied for it. And in the course of the interview process, a then lead producer, now our production director, John Haidt, asked me a question over lunch. Ian, why do you want to stop making things? Why do you want to be a lead? Why do you want to be a manager instead? And I did not have a good answer to that question, because I hadn't really fully thought of it in those terms up until that point. It's a question I still ask people in interviews today when they want to move from being individual contributors to being leaders. Because it's very different doing X versus leading people and mentoring them and guiding them as they do X, whatever that may be. And there's a trap that people often fall into, where your best artist or your best engineer or best whatever gets promoted into a position where they no longer are actually making art or no longer are actually writing code. And maybe they're not as good a manager. Maybe they're not as good a leader. But they were conditioned to think, like, this is the next step they should take in life. And they end up less happy, and the team as a whole ends up worse off because they've lost a great source of contribution. And John wanted to make sure that I wasn't falling into that trap. I actually took a lot of time to reflect on it, and it occurred to me that this is actually what I wanted to do. There were a lot of parallels, a lot of lessons I learned from actually raid leading. And I've never been the best player in my raid group. I wasn't the single most skilled raider. But I was good at identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the group and assigning them to roles that suited those strengths and weaknesses. and facilitating and smoothing out conflicts and helping people work through the challenges that come with trying to cooperate to get something done on a large scale. And that's what I threw myself into at work from that point forward. I think when I first moved into the role, I actually had a meeting with the encounter design team who had been my peers just days earlier. And one of the first things I said to them was, please, I don't want you to forget this. I'm not suddenly magically a better designer or smarter or have better ideas than I did yesterday just because I have the word lead in my title right now. Don't think of me that way. Just think of me as a resource who can help you, who can, if you have problems that I can help you with, I can help you solve, let me know. And I think this began a transition and a shift into thinking more as a leader, more as a manager, and less as a doer, less as an implementer. And yeah, so this was one of the first giant raid zones we set out to tackle, Throne of Thunder. I think one of the big goals for us over the course of the Mists of Pandaria expansion was to do more, to do it faster, to keep our level of quality with the same team size that we'd had in Cataclysm. And over the course of this expansion, we made literally twice as many raid bosses as we had in Cataclysm, in my opinion, without sacrificing quality. And I think that has set a standard and set a benchmark that World of Warcraft has tried to carry forward since then, in terms of how ambitious we are, how large our raids are, what we try to accomplish with them. Now, moving into Warlords of Draenor, another opportunity opened up, and I shifted from being a lead encounter designer to a lead game designer. And I think this kind of reconciled my early background in doing some systems work and doing some creative encounter work. And it was, for me, a best of both worlds. I'd always been interested in all sides of the game, and this let me actually, explore all of them simultaneously. But as I moved into this role, I started to notice something, that the way that I related to people, the way that other people related to me, was changing as my responsibility shifted, as my title changed over the years. And the process that I'd followed for getting ideas into the game wasn't actually playing out the way it had once done. Now, when I was a new designer on the World of Warcraft team, if I had an idea, had a suggestion, something I thought we should do, whether it was small or big, I might start out by bouncing it off my peers, folks sitting at desks right near me, to see what they thought, if they had any suggestions. If I still liked it and they seemed excited, I would let my lead know and say, hey, I had this idea, what if we tried doing X or Y? And if they liked it, then we'd socialize it further with the other members of the team leadership, and eventually it might make it into the game. If it did, it was almost certainly improved along the way by being challenged, by having a lot of questions, by having suggestions, things to augment it, introduced by every other person who shared in the creative process. And a lot of the time, ideas that I woke up thinking were brilliant, I quickly realized were terrible after running them by just a few people. But here, by 2014, as a lead game designer, I was actually having a much easier time getting my ideas into the game because there were way fewer people who could tell me no. And my ideas weren't necessarily better than they were 5 years earlier. I mean, maybe they were a bit more refined, maybe they were a bit more, polished by lessons learned. But I was no longer going through the same process. Forgive the cheesy metaphor, but I think this is a crucible, right? A crucible is something in blacksmithing that helps filter out impurities to create a better, stronger whole as your final product. And I think I'd been putting my ideas through this process almost automatically by necessity, because if I didn't, well, then there was no way they were going to get into the game because there were gatekeepers between me and that. As I gained more responsibility on my team, I had to force this process to play out. I had to actively go seek out not just peers, but people on the team that worked for me, and as many different voices as I could find to run my ideas past, to challenge, so that this crucible could make them better for the sake of the game as a whole. And I think it's something that had I just continued to go about my business unconsciously, being like, well, yeah, I'll run my ideas past my boss, and then if they say yes, I'll put them in the game, I think the game would have been worse off for it. So then, as we're getting closer to the present day, I have to admit I have probably fewer lessons, fewer insights at this point. I haven't had as much time to really reflect and totally process what I've learned along the way. But I do know one thing. As Legion came out, my boss, Tom Chilton, who'd been game director of World of Warcraft from 2008 onwards, and who'd been on World of Warcraft from like 2003 onwards. He'd been a lead game designer in Ultima Online previously, like one of the real godfathers of the MMO genre. He was also wanting to move on to another project within Blizzard. 10 years, 15 years in a game is quite a bit. And that left me looking to move into those very, very big shoes to fill. And as I moved into that role, I was excited. I mean, I was awestruck. I was humbled by the responsibility, but also just terrified. And I think this was an extension of something that I had felt throughout my career, and that I still carry with me to this day. I think the convenient shorthand for it, Imposter Syndrome. The idea that other people, other people are looking to you, and theoretically, you're supposed to be a beacon of judgment and responsibility and guidance. But especially when you first come into a role, you don't necessarily know what you're doing. And I look forward to reading the forum threads tomorrow. Ian finally admits he has no idea what he's doing. But whether it was me first coming into creative brainstorming meetings and feeling entirely uncomfortable, or unsure how to bear the mantle of leadership, or unsure how to bear the responsibilities of guiding a team of 300 brilliant developers to create a game that millions of players are expecting and waiting for. It's something that I think is natural. So I think, first off, if this is something that you feel in any area of your life, know that you're not alone. Know that I think it's a healthy, natural part of this process. Moving into a new role, of course you're not an expert at the role. Like, I was comparing myself to somebody who had done it for almost a decade. And I'm comparing myself on my first day in the job to his 8th year in the job. But second, I think it's actually something that you can lean on and actually can strengthen you in some ways. I think, for me, I try to keep this in mind. It helps keep me, I think, humble and grounded. That crucible of ideas I talked about a couple slides earlier, if I wake up one day and I think, oh, no, yeah, I'm the greatest game director. I was born to do this. Maybe I'm not running all of my ideas past as many people as I possibly can. And ultimately, trust in the process that got you to the place where you are, whether it's the leaders who promoted you directly, whether it's a test that you passed, some screening that you made it through. Others place their faith in you, have their judgment in your ability to excel. And clearly, if you're comparing yourself to them and you think they're so great, they might know something. And so that brings us back to August 2018, as I stand here. I am super excited to join all of you in exploring PAX this weekend. If you see me out and about at the convention anywhere, please don't hesitate to come up and say hi. I'm always happy to chat. And after, I can't wait to get back to Irvine and to continue building the next chapter of this journey for myself, for my team, for millions of players around the world. Thank you. Welcome to PAX 2018.